Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight, we're talking about bathing. Or more specifically, the long, quiet stretches of history where people simply didn't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see how far these stories travel while everyone else is asleep. At some point in school, most of us absorb a very simple idea. Medieval people were dirty. They didn't bathe. They smelled terrible. Everyone was constantly sick. Life was short, unpleasant, and vaguely sticky. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. No modern plumbing. No soap dispensers. No hot showers waiting politely behind a door. So it feels natural to assume that medieval Europe must have been a continent-sized hygiene failure. But that assumption turns out to be incomplete. Because while medieval people did bathe far less than we do, they also managed to avoid turning their towns into mass graves caused by their own smell. Which suggests that something else was happening. Something quieter. Something less dramatic than regular bathing, but far more consistent. Medieval hygiene wasn't absent. It was just not centered on water. In the modern world, cleanliness is something we schedule. We shower. We bathe. We decide, very deliberately, to stop what we're doing and remove dirt with hot water. Cleanliness is an event. In medieval life, cleanliness was ambient. It happened continuously, in small, unremarkable ways, woven into daily survival. This difference matters more than people realize. To understand medieval bathing, you first have to forget the idea that people felt dirty the same way we do. Dirt, in a medieval sense, wasn't about sweat or smell. It was about visible filth, rot, and stagnation. Things that stayed still long enough to become dangerous. Sweat itself wasn't the enemy. Stillness was. Medieval people lived in motion. They walked constantly. They worked outdoors. They labored in wind, sun, rain, and cold. Their clothes were made of wool and linen, fabrics that behave very differently from modern synthetics. Wool, especially, does something strange. It resists bacteria. It breathes. It sheds moisture instead of trapping it. A modern cotton shirt worn for 3 days becomes a personal regret. A wool tunic worn for a week becomes normal. Not fresh. Not pleasant. But not actively hostile. Medieval clothing was designed to be aired, brushed, and dried, not washed daily. Washing was hard. Water had to be hauled. Heated. Protected from contamination. Soap existed, but it was harsh, precious, and often damaging to fabric. So instead of bathing the body, medieval people cleaned the things touching the body. Clothes were brushed daily. Beaten. Aired in sunlight. Hung near fires. Smoke mattered here. Smoke kills insects. Smoke dries fabric. Smoke discourages the tiny life forms that cause rot. A smoky house wasn't cozy. It was sanitary. And bodies were cleaned selectively. Hands were washed constantly. Before food. After work. Faces were wiped. Feet were cleaned when possible. Hair was combed aggressively, which removed dirt and parasites more effectively than water alone. Water bathing happened, but not casually. Rivers, bathhouses, tubs brought out on special occasions. Bathing was often seasonal. Spring baths were common. Pre-holiday baths mattered. Illness baths happened. But daily immersion? Rare. And yet, people survived. Which tells us something uncomfortable. Clean does not always mean wet. What medieval people feared wasn't dirt itself. It was dampness. Dampness is where skin breaks down. Dampness is where mold grows. Dampness is where sickness begins quietly and then refuses to leave. Cold, damp skin is dangerous. Dry, dirty skin is survivable. So medieval hygiene prioritized dryness above all else. Homes were drafty on purpose. Windows were small but constant airflow was normal. Fireplaces burned almost constantly, not just for warmth, but to dry the air. Bedding was aired. Straw mattresses were replaced regularly, not washed. And this pattern repeats everywhere. Medieval streets smelled, yes, but they were not sealed containers. Wind moved constantly through towns. Narrow streets created wind tunnels. Waste was removed quickly, not stored. Things that sat too long were seen as threats, not inconveniences. Bathing, when it happened too often, was actually viewed with suspicion. Warm water opens pores. Open pores invite illness. This wasn't superstition alone. People noticed patterns. Those who soaked frequently in warm baths got sick more often during cold seasons. So moderation became wisdom. The body was not meant to be softened daily. It was meant to be resilient. And this logic extended into medicine, religion, and social norms. Excessive bathing became associated with luxury, weakness, and moral softness. Cleanliness was virtuous, but indulgence was not. Which is why medieval people could go weeks without bathing and still function. Not comfortably. Not pleasantly. But effectively. And effectiveness, in a world without antibiotics, mattered more than comfort ever could. And once you accept that medieval cleanliness was built around dryness rather than washing, a lot of other strange behaviors start to make sense. Smell, for example. Modern people are extremely sensitive to smell, not because we're biologically superior, but because we live in sealed environments. Our homes are boxes. Our cars are boxes. Our offices are boxes. Air circulates politely, but it doesn't leave. Smells linger. They sit with you. They demand attention. Medieval air did not linger. Even indoors, airflow was constant. Walls were imperfect. Doors didn't seal. Windows were open more often than closed. Smoke drifted in and out. Wind found its way through every gap it could. Smell existed, but it moved. It passed through. It did not settle long enough to become a problem. Which meant medieval people experienced odor differently. A bad smell was temporary. It arrived, announced itself rudely, and then left. You didn't build your life around eliminating it completely because it never stayed long enough to justify panic. This matters because smell is often our first signal of danger. When something smells wrong to us today, it's usually because bacteria have had time to organize. Medieval people rarely gave bacteria that time. Sweat dried quickly. Waste moved away quickly. Food scraps didn't linger. Clothing was aired daily. Bedding was exposed to sun and fire. Moisture was treated like an enemy that could not be trusted. So while medieval towns absolutely smelled stronger than modern ones, they didn't necessarily smell more dangerous. There's a difference. Dangerous smells are stagnant. They are sweet, heavy, persistent. They cling. They indicate that something has been quietly decomposing for too long. Medieval life, harsh as it was, rarely allowed things to sit quietly. Work began early. Fires were lit. Doors opened. Animals moved through streets. People walked constantly. Movement dominated everything. Stillness was rare. Even sleep was lighter. People woke during the night. Fires were tended. Air shifted. Nothing stayed sealed long enough to rot unnoticed. Bathing, in this context, was not ignored. It was rationed. Cold water washing happened far more often than people realize. Faces, hands, and feet were cleaned regularly because they were exposed, visible, and vulnerable to cracking and infection. These areas mattered. But soaking the entire body in warm water was different. That was a risk. Warmth plus moisture softened skin. Soft skin broke more easily. Broken skin invited infection. In a world without antibiotics, a small skin infection was not minor. It was a negotiation with fate. So medieval people avoided practices that made their bodies fragile. Hard skin was protective. Calluses were assets. Dryness was safety. This is also why medieval clothing looks heavy and layered. Layers trap warmth without trapping moisture. Wool insulates even when damp, but it also dries quickly when exposed to air. Linen pulls moisture away from the skin and releases it. Modern clothing traps sweat. Medieval clothing released it. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. A medieval person could wear the same clothing for days and still be healthier than a modern person wearing synthetic fabrics for 12 hours. Not cleaner. Healthier. Because health, in this period, was about minimizing small risks, not maximizing comfort. And bathing, oddly enough, introduced risk. This became especially clear during times of disease. When plague struck, people noticed patterns. Those who bathed frequently, especially in warm communal baths, were more likely to fall ill. Again, they didn't know about bacteria, but they saw outcomes. Warm water weakened the body. It opened pores. It made people vulnerable. So bathhouses, once common in medieval cities, slowly declined. Not because people forgot hygiene, but because they associated bathing with sickness. A bathhouse was warm, enclosed, humid, and full of people. From a medieval perspective, it was a perfect place for illness to gather strength. And they weren't wrong. Communal baths, when poorly ventilated, absolutely spread disease. Medieval people learned this empirically. So they adapted. They didn't stop caring about cleanliness. They changed how they achieved it. Dry brushing became common. Cloth rubbing. Scraping skin gently to remove dirt without soaking it. Hair was combed daily, not casually, but thoroughly. Combs were cleaning tools. They removed lice, eggs, dirt, and dead skin. This was slow hygiene. Not dramatic. Not refreshing. But consistent, and consistency mattered more than intensity. Even religious life reinforced this approach. Monasteries emphasized moderation. Cleanliness was encouraged, but indulgence was discouraged. Excessive bathing was seen as vanity. Not because water was evil, but because obsession was. The body was to be maintained, not pampered. And this mindset extended to children. Medieval children were rarely bathed daily, but they were constantly exposed to fresh air, movement, and sunlight. They ran, worked, played, and slept in environments that didn't trap moisture. Their immune systems developed differently. Not stronger in a heroic sense, but accustomed to minor exposures. Infections happened, of course. People died. Life was harsh. But it wasn't the unbroken filth catastrophe we imagine. It was structured roughness. Even hair, which modern people fixate on, was handled pragmatically. Hair was kept covered. Hats, hoods, veils. Covering hair protected it from dirt, sun, insects, and moisture. Hair didn't need daily washing if it wasn't constantly exposed. And when hair was cleaned, it was done with ashes, herbs, or mild soaps, followed by long drying periods. Wet hair in cold air was dangerous. Head colds were serious. So again, dryness wins. The medieval world was not clean by modern standards, but it was not careless. It was optimized for survival with limited resources. And that optimization produced a kind of quiet hygiene that doesn't look impressive to us, but worked well enough to keep societies functioning for centuries. Which is perhaps the most uncomfortable realization. Medieval people weren't ignorant of dirt. They simply feared different things than we do. We fear smell. They feared moisture. We fear discomfort. They feared softness. We fear dirt. They feared stagnation. And in that difference lies the reason they could live without bathing the way we do, without immediately collapsing under the weight of their own environment. They weren't clean the way we are. They were clean enough. As medieval life unfolded day after day, season after season, hygiene quietly adjusted itself to the rhythm of the year. This is something modern people rarely consider, because our environments barely change. Indoors feels the same in January as it does in July. Medieval life did not offer that illusion. Winter was dry, cold, and unforgiving. Fires burned constantly, not just for warmth, but to keep moisture away. Clothing dried near hearths. Skin cracked, not from dirt, but from dryness. In winter, bathing was rare not because people disliked it, but because wet skin in cold air was dangerous. A winter bath could turn into illness, and illness could quietly end a life. So winter hygiene focused on protection. Extra layers. Grease and oils rubbed into skin to prevent cracking. Hair covered tightly. Hands cleaned often, but the rest of the body left mostly alone. Cleanliness meant staying intact. Summer was different. Heat brought sweat. Sweat brought smell. Smell brought insects. But again, the solution was not soaking. It was exposure. Clothes were lighter. Linen replaced wool. Bodies dried quickly in sun and wind. Rivers and streams were used more often, but briefly. Quick washes. No long soaking. Let the water touch the skin, then leave. The goal was always the same. Remove immediate filth. Avoid lingering dampness. This seasonal logic extended into towns and villages. Waste was handled differently depending on weather. In dry months, it was removed quickly and spread far. In wet months, it was managed carefully to prevent buildup. Streets were not clean, but they were active. Animals moved through them. People swept. Wind did the rest. The medieval world was loud, open, and constantly disturbed. And disturbance, it turns out, is hostile to disease. Even the way people slept reinforced this pattern. Beds were not plush traps for moisture. Mattresses were straw or wool, materials that could be replaced, aired, or burned if necessary. Bedding was shaken daily. Left in sunlight. Hung where air could move through it. Sleeping naked, as some modern people do for comfort, was uncommon. Clothing protected skin from drafts and insects. It absorbed sweat and could be aired out the next day. Skin stayed dry. Skin stayed tough. This wasn't comfort. It was strategy. And strategies like this don't look impressive when judged by modern luxury standards. But they were built through centuries of trial, error, and quiet observation. When people did get sick, hygiene changed again. The ill were isolated when possible. Bedding was removed or burned. Clothes were aired aggressively. The goal was not sterility. It was separation. Don't let sickness linger. Don't let it settle into the environment. This same logic applied to death. Bodies were buried quickly. Homes were cleaned with smoke and air. Doors opened. Fires lit. Life resumed, not because people were heartless, but because stagnation invited danger. There was no concept of disinfectant, but there was a deep understanding of what felt unsafe. Heavy air. Damp rooms. Lingering smells. Darkness that stayed too long. These were warning signs. So medieval hygiene became a language of avoidance. Avoid dampness. Avoid stillness. Avoid indulgence. Avoid excess. Which brings us to something rarely mentioned. Medieval people did not expect to smell neutral. Neutral smell is a modern obsession. A medieval person expected to smell like work, smoke, wool, leather, and the environment they lived in. This wasn't shameful. It was information. It told others who you were and what you did. Strong, unpleasant smells were disliked, but natural human odor was accepted. Trying to erase it completely would have seemed strange, even suspicious. Perfumes existed, yes, but they were not daily tools. They were occasional, symbolic, and often religious. Scent was layered onto life, not used to erase it. This acceptance reduced anxiety. People weren't constantly judging themselves by invisible standards. Hygiene was practical, not psychological. Which may be one reason medieval people could endure conditions that would make modern people deeply uncomfortable within hours. They were not constantly measuring themselves against perfection. They aimed for functionality. And functionality extended even into medicine. Medieval medical texts often warned against excessive bathing, especially during illness. Water weakened the body. Steam loosened vital energies. Dry heat strengthened. Again, not scientifically accurate in modern terms, but effective in outcome. Sick people kept warm and dry survived more often than those chilled and soaked. Even childbirth followed this logic. Warmth without dampness. Clean cloths, not baths. Air movement mattered. Across every stage of life, the same principle appeared again and again. Dry is safe. Wet is risky. So when we imagine medieval people as unwashed, it's not entirely wrong. But it's deeply misleading. They weren't neglecting hygiene. They were practicing a different version of it. One shaped by environment, materials, and hard-earned experience. And that version quietly worked well enough to sustain entire civilizations without collapsing under their own dirt. Which should make us pause. Because it suggests that cleanliness is not universal. It is contextual. And what works best depends less on ideals and more on what your world allows. In a damp, cold, unpredictable environment, medieval hygiene prioritized survival. In our sealed, climate-controlled world, modern hygiene prioritizes comfort and social signaling. Neither is inherently superior. They simply solve different problems. And when you look at medieval life through that lens, bathing stops being a moral issue or a sign of ignorance. It becomes just another calculated risk. One they chose to take less often. Once you stop expecting medieval hygiene to resemble ours, you begin to notice how carefully their entire environment was arranged to support the body without pampering it. Even the materials surrounding daily life played a role that modern spaces simply don't. Wood, for example, dominated everything. Floors, walls, furniture, tools. Wood breathes. It absorbs moisture and releases it slowly. It doesn't trap dampness the way stone or metal can. A wooden bench that gets wet will dry. A wooden floor exposed to fire and air will not quietly collect condensation. Stone buildings existed, especially in cities, but they were rarely sealed. Stone walls were thick, but interiors were kept warm with constant fires and airflow. Smoke drifted through spaces, coating surfaces lightly. Not pleasant, but effective. Smoke discourages insects, mold, and bacteria. It preserves more than it pollutes. Modern people would find medieval interiors uncomfortable, even oppressive. But discomfort was not a failure. It was part of the system. Comfort traps. Discomfort moves. Furniture was sparse for a reason. Fewer surfaces meant fewer places for dirt to settle unnoticed. What existed was visible. What was visible was managed. Nothing disappeared behind upholstery or beneath carpeting to quietly evolve into a problem. Even personal belongings followed this logic. People owned fewer items. Fewer clothes. Fewer textiles. What they owned mattered. It was maintained, repaired, aired, and reused. Accumulation was not possible for most people, and that unintentionally prevented filth from organizing itself. Hygiene thrives on attention, not abundance. This also shaped how medieval people thought about the body itself. The body was not expected to be constantly refreshed. It was expected to endure. To work. To adapt. Cleanliness was about maintaining function, not sensation. Modern bathing gives us a feeling of reset. Medieval hygiene aimed for stability. You didn't need to feel clean. You needed to stay useful. And usefulness meant avoiding injuries, infections, and exhaustion. Everything else was secondary. Skin care, for example, focused on preventing cracks and sores. Oils and fats were used sparingly to protect exposed areas. Hands, feet, and faces were the priority. The rest of the body was left alone unless there was a reason to intervene. This selective attention reduced risk. Less interference meant fewer chances for damage. Hair care followed similar rules. Hair was not washed often, but it was protected constantly. Covered hair stayed cleaner longer. It also stayed warmer and drier. Hair oils, natural or applied, helped repel dirt and moisture. Lice existed, of course. Parasites were a reality. But daily combing controlled them more effectively than occasional washing ever could. Removing parasites mechanically works even today. Medieval people just did it without naming it. What's striking is how little of this required belief. It wasn't ideological. It was habitual. People didn't wake up thinking about hygiene as a concept. They simply lived in ways that minimized obvious risks. And because everyone lived this way, there was no shame attached to it. No one was comparing themselves to an unreachable standard. This matters psychologically. Shame weakens people. Constant self-monitoring drains energy. Medieval people, for all their hardships, were not burdened by constant anxiety about smelling acceptable to strangers in enclosed spaces. Their social world expected bodies to smell like bodies. That expectation made endurance easier. And endurance was the true currency of survival. When historians talk about medieval life expectancy, they often miss this nuance. Yes, average life expectancy was low due to infant mortality. But adults who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s. Not rare. Not miraculous. Common enough to shape society. That doesn't happen in a world drowning in filth. It happens in a world that quietly manages risk without drawing attention to itself. Even urban environments followed this pattern. Medieval cities were dense, but not sealed. Markets operated outdoors. Work happened in open air. Animals moved freely, which sounds unsanitary, but movement prevents buildup. Waste was unpleasant, but it was not hidden. Hidden filth is the most dangerous kind. Later periods tried to hide waste. To store it. To contain it behind walls and under floors. And sickness exploded. Medieval people did the opposite. They exposed everything to air, sun, and motion. Which is why later generations, with better technology but worse assumptions, often suffered more. Progress is not linear. And hygiene is not about perfection. It is about preventing small problems from becoming big ones. Medieval people understood this instinctively. They didn't scrub away every trace of life. They made sure nothing stayed long enough to turn against them. So when you imagine medieval people rarely bathing, try not to picture neglect. Picture restraint. Picture a world where water was powerful, warmth was dangerous, and dryness meant safety. Picture people who lived close enough to the elements to learn what mattered, not through theory, but through consequence. They were not clean the way we define it. They were resilient. And resilience, quietly, kept them alive. Over time, this resilience shaped not just daily habits, but expectations about the human body itself. Medieval people expected their bodies to be marked by life. Rough hands were normal. Weathered skin was expected. Scars were stories, not defects. The body was evidence of survival, not something to be constantly corrected. This perspective changed how hygiene was understood. Cleanliness was not about restoring the body to a pristine state. It was about keeping it functional enough to keep going tomorrow. And tomorrow mattered more than today feeling pleasant. Because medieval life was unpredictable. Weather shifted without warning. Food supplies fluctuated. Work was seasonal but relentless. Injury could arrive quietly and stay permanently. In that context, anything that reduced risk, even slightly, was taken seriously. Bathing reduced risk sometimes. But it increased risk at others. So it was used sparingly, deliberately, and with caution. People bathed before major life events. Weddings. Religious festivals. Important journeys. These moments justified the risk. The body was strengthened beforehand. Warmth was ensured. Drying was careful and complete. Bathing was an event, not a routine. And because it was an event, it carried meaning. It was symbolic. It marked transition. It wasn't just about removing dirt. It was about preparing the body for something important. In daily life, however, the quieter methods ruled. Rubbing skin with cloth. Brushing dirt away. Letting sweat dry. Letting wind pass over you. Letting smoke do its work. These actions were not dramatic, but they were constant. And constancy builds stability. It also built tolerance. Medieval immune systems were shaped by steady, low-level exposure. Not overwhelming filth, but regular contact with the environment. This created bodies that reacted differently to discomfort. Not invulnerable, but adapted. Modern immune systems, sheltered and sanitized, react more violently to minor intrusions. Allergies. Sensitivities. Overreactions. Medieval bodies had fewer expectations and, paradoxically, fewer shocks. This isn't nostalgia. Medieval life was dangerous. Many people suffered and died. But it was not chaotic in the way we often imagine. It was ordered around necessity. Even the absence of frequent bathing fit into that order. When people finally did bathe, they did so with awareness. Water temperature mattered. Timing mattered. Aftercare mattered. Dry clothes were essential. Warmth was restored immediately. Bathing without proper drying was considered reckless. And recklessness was frowned upon not because it was immoral, but because it burdened others. A sick person required care. Care cost time and resources. Everyone understood this. So self-maintenance was a social responsibility. That included knowing when not to bathe. This communal awareness extended into households. Families monitored each other. Children were taught early what conditions were safe. Cold air plus wet hair was discouraged. Bare feet on damp ground were corrected. These weren't superstitions. They were patterns observed over generations. Get chilled, get sick. Stay dry, stay useful. Simple logic. Ruthlessly reinforced. Which leads to a strange conclusion. Medieval hygiene wasn't primitive. It was conservative. It avoided extremes. It avoided indulgence. It avoided unnecessary risk. In a world without backups, caution was wisdom. And while modern people may recoil at the idea of rarely bathing, medieval people might look at modern habits and see something equally strange. Daily hot water. Stripping the skin of oils. Trapping moisture in sealed clothing. Living indoors for most of the day. From their perspective, this might look fragile. Too dependent on systems that could fail. Too focused on sensation. Too confident that medicine would fix mistakes. Medieval people did not have that confidence. So they lived differently. They trusted dryness. They trusted movement. They trusted exposure over enclosure. And in doing so, they built a version of hygiene that matched their world. Not ours. And that difference is where misunderstanding lies. We imagine medieval people as dirty because they didn't bathe the way we do. They might imagine us as reckless because we bathe too much. Neither view is entirely wrong. But only one of them was built for survival without safety nets. And that is what medieval hygiene really was. Not neglect. Not ignorance. But adaptation. As generations passed, this adaptive approach to hygiene became so deeply embedded in daily life that people rarely thought about it consciously. It wasn't taught in lessons. It wasn't debated. It was absorbed simply by living among others who did the same things, in the same ways, for the same reasons. Children learned by watching. They learned that clothes were aired, not abandoned. That hands were washed when needed, not obsessively. That mud dried and fell away, while dampness clung and caused trouble. They learned that warmth was valuable, but moisture was suspicious. These lessons were not dramatic. They were quiet, repeated, and rarely questioned. And because everyone followed the same rhythm, hygiene became invisible. This invisibility is important. When a system works well, people stop noticing it. It becomes background. Medieval hygiene was like that. Not impressive enough to write songs about. Not obvious enough to stand out. But persistent enough to matter. Even language reflects this. Medieval texts talk far more about illness caused by cold, wet conditions than by dirt alone. Damp air, chilled limbs, soaked clothing, these were the dangers people named. Dirt was unpleasant, but wet dirt was feared. That distinction shaped architecture, clothing, and behavior. Shoes, for instance, were not designed to keep feet perfectly clean. They were designed to keep feet dry. Elevated soles, thick leather, and reparable construction mattered more than appearance. A shoe that kept water out was valuable. A shoe that looked clean but let moisture in was not. The same logic applied to gloves, cloaks, and head coverings. Coverage prevented wetness. Wetness weakened the body. Weak bodies didn't last long. Even when people traveled, hygiene followed them. Travelers did not expect to bathe along the road. They expected to dry out. Inns focused on fires, not baths. Warmth and rest came first. Washing, if it happened, was secondary. This approach reduced dependency. You didn't need infrastructure to stay healthy. You needed awareness. And awareness traveled well. That's why medieval people could move between environments, fields, forests, towns, ships, without constantly falling ill. Their hygiene wasn't tied to a room or a device. It was tied to behavior. Behavior is portable. Which also explains why medieval armies could march long distances without collapsing immediately from disease. They suffered, yes. But they followed the same rules. Air things out. Don't let waste sit. Keep moving. Stay dry when possible. Later armies, with tents and enclosed quarters, often did worse. Once again, comfort created vulnerability. This pattern repeats throughout history, quietly reminding us that convenience is not the same as safety. Medieval bathing habits, or the lack of them, fit into this larger pattern. They were not an oversight. They were a trade-off. Less immediate comfort in exchange for long-term resilience. And resilience mattered in ways modern people rarely have to consider. When you have no antibiotics, no sterile dressings, no reliable medical intervention, prevention becomes everything. Every small habit that reduces risk compounds over time. Avoiding unnecessary bathing was one of those habits. Not because water was bad. But because water, used carelessly, was unpredictable. A medieval person stepping into a bath wasn't thinking about relaxation. They were thinking about timing, temperature, and recovery. They were thinking about whether the day was warm enough, whether dry clothes were ready, whether the fire would still be burning afterward. That level of calculation slows things down. And slowing down discourages excess. Which is why bathing never became casual. It remained deliberate, and deliberate practices tend to survive longer than fashionable ones. So when we judge medieval people for their hygiene, we're often judging them for not sharing our assumptions. We assume water is safe, warmth is controlled, and sickness is manageable. They assumed none of that. They assumed the world was hostile and required constant negotiation. Their hygiene reflects that assumption perfectly. It was not designed to make life pleasant. It was designed to make life continue. And it did. Quietly, imperfectly, but effectively enough to carry societies through centuries of instability, climate shifts, and hardship. Which is perhaps the most humbling part. Not that medieval people lived without bathing. But that they lived well enough without it. As medieval life carried on in this way, people developed an almost instinctive sense for when the body needed intervention and when it was better left alone. This instinct didn't come from theory or instruction manuals. It came from watching what happened when someone ignored the quiet rules everyone else followed. Someone who bathed too often in cold seasons got sick. Someone who stayed damp too long developed sores. Someone who neglected airing clothes attracted pests. These lessons were absorbed without argument. And because they were learned through consequence, they were respected. This respect shaped patience. Medieval people were patient with discomfort. Cold fingers, stiff joints, rough skin, these were temporary annoyances, not emergencies. Panic was reserved for things that lingered. Pain that didn't fade. Smells that didn't move. Dampness that refused to dry. Lingering was the enemy. So daily life was designed to prevent it. Work naturally supported this. Labor warmed the body. Movement encouraged circulation. Sweat dried quickly in open air. Even rest was rarely complete stillness. People shifted, tended fires, adjusted layers. Stillness long enough to become dangerous was uncommon. This is another reason bathing felt unnecessary most of the time. The body was constantly self-regulating through activity. Dirt fell away. Sweat evaporated. Skin toughened. Bathing would interrupt that balance. It would soften what had hardened. It would cool what needed warmth. It would reset the body when stability was safer. So bathing remained rare, careful, and purposeful. Even nobility followed this logic more than we expect. While wealth allowed for tubs, heated water, and attendants, aristocrats were still cautious. Excessive bathing was associated with decadence and weakness. A ruler who bathed constantly was not admired. They were questioned. Strength was valued. Endurance mattered. Which is why medieval hygiene never became about luxury, even among the wealthy. There were perfumes, oils, and scented waters, yes. But these were applied lightly and infrequently. They complemented the body. They didn't attempt to override it. The idea of erasing natural odor completely would have seemed unnatural. And that idea, more than anything, separates medieval thinking from modern habits. Modern hygiene is about control. Control over scent. Control over appearance. Control over sensation. Medieval hygiene was about cooperation. Cooperation with climate, materials, and limitations. You worked with the world you had. And that world was unpredictable. Weather could change suddenly. A warm day could turn cold by evening. Rain could arrive without warning. Fires could fail. Clothing could soak through. A simple bath, taken at the wrong time, could become a turning point. So caution ruled. That caution extended into beliefs about health that sound strange to us now, but made sense then. People believed illness entered through weakness. Through openings. Through moments when the body was unguarded. Bathing created those moments. So it was limited. And while some of these beliefs were wrong in detail, they were often right in effect. People who stayed warm, dry, and rested survived more often than those who did not. So the system reinforced itself. Over time, it became tradition. Tradition is powerful not because it's always correct, but because it accumulates evidence slowly. Medieval hygiene traditions survived because they produced acceptable outcomes. Not perfect ones. Acceptable ones. Which is all survival ever really requires. When we imagine medieval people living without frequent baths, we often imagine neglect, indifference, or ignorance. But what we're really seeing is restraint. A willingness to endure mild discomfort to avoid serious harm. That willingness is difficult for modern people to relate to, because our environment cushions us. We can make mistakes and recover. We can bathe excessively and apply lotion. We can get sick and seek treatment. Medieval people did not have that margin. So they lived carefully. They accepted smells. They accepted roughness. They accepted inconvenience. In exchange, they gained stability. And stability allowed communities to function, trade to continue, families to form, and knowledge to pass forward. Quietly. Without needing daily baths. Over long stretches of time, this careful balance between cleanliness and restraint shaped how medieval people understood health itself. Health was not a permanent state. It was something you maintained day by day, mostly by avoiding obvious mistakes. You didn't chase perfect wellness. You avoided decline. And decline often started small. A chill that lingered. Skin that stayed damp too long. Clothes that were put away wet. These were the beginnings of problems, not dramatic events. So medieval hygiene focused on preventing these beginnings rather than correcting them later. That's why so many daily habits revolved around drying. Drying clothes. Drying hair. Drying skin. Drying living spaces. Fire and air worked together constantly. Even in summer, fires were kept going, not always for warmth, but to maintain dryness. This makes medieval interiors feel strange to modern sensibilities. Warm, smoky, drafty, and uneven. But these conditions discouraged the kinds of slow, invisible growth that cause sickness. Nothing felt sealed. And sealing, as it turns out, is dangerous when you don't fully understand what you're sealing in. Medieval people didn't think in terms of bacteria, but they understood outcomes. Places that stayed damp caused illness. Places that stayed dry did not. So they structured their lives accordingly. Bathing interfered with that structure. A bath introduced a large amount of moisture all at once. Moisture that had to be managed carefully. Moisture that could linger in hair, clothing, and skin if conditions weren't perfect. So most days, bathing simply wasn't worth the risk. Instead, people relied on gradual cleanliness. Dirt fell away over time. Oils balanced themselves. Skin adapted to its environment. Clothes absorbed sweat and released it slowly. Nothing happened suddenly. And slow systems are often more stable than intense ones. This is why medieval hygiene feels almost boring when described honestly. There's no dramatic cleansing ritual. No sharp contrast between dirty and clean. Just a steady state of good enough. And good enough kept people alive. Even during outbreaks of disease, this mindset held. When sickness spread, people didn't suddenly start bathing more. They did the opposite. They stayed warm. They avoided damp places. They limited contact. They increased airflow. Bathing was not seen as protective. It was seen as risky. That choice may seem strange now, but in a world without scientific explanations, people relied on patterns. And the patterns they observed told them that dampness weakened the body. So they avoided it. It's also worth noting that medieval people did not live in constant fear of their own bodies. Sweat was normal. Dirt was expected. These things were part of being alive. Trying to erase them completely would have seemed pointless. Instead, attention was given to what mattered most. Injuries. Sores. Cracks in the skin. These were dangerous. These were monitored. Cleanliness focused on protecting the body's boundaries, not polishing its surface. Hands mattered because they touched everything. Feet mattered because they carried weight. Faces mattered because they were exposed to cold and wind. The rest of the body was left largely alone. This selective hygiene reduced workload. It conserved resources. It minimized risk. And it fit perfectly into a life that already demanded constant effort. No one had energy to waste on unnecessary rituals. And that is perhaps the clearest explanation of all. Medieval people did not bathe often because they could not afford to. Not in money, but in energy, time, and risk. Everything they did had to justify itself. Bathing rarely did. So it became occasional, careful, and meaningful. And that choice, repeated across generations, quietly shaped a world where people lived, worked, aged, and died without ever feeling particularly unclean. Not by our standards. But by theirs, they were doing just fine. As centuries passed, these habits became so normal that no one thought of them as hygiene at all. They were simply how life was lived. You rose with the light, you worked until tired, you ate when food was available, and you kept yourself from becoming too cold, too wet, or too weak. Cleanliness existed inside that rhythm, not outside it. Water, when used, was treated with care. Rivers were respected but not trusted. Wells were guarded closely. Rainwater was collected and stored. Warm water required effort, fuel, and time, which meant it was rarely wasted on the entire body at once. Instead, water was used precisely. A cloth dipped in warm water for the face. A rinse for the hands before meals. A quick wash for the feet at the end of the day. These small actions fit into daily life without disrupting it. They didn't leave the body soaked. They didn't require long drying times. They didn't expose skin to sudden temperature changes. They were safe. And safety, in the medieval world, mattered more than comfort. This mindset extended into medicine as well. Medieval healers were cautious people. Treatments were gentle, gradual, and often aimed at restoring balance rather than forcing change. Sudden shifts, whether in diet, temperature, or routine, were viewed with suspicion. Bathing was a sudden shift. Especially hot bathing. Hot water opened the pores, softened the skin, and relaxed the body. All pleasant effects, but also dangerous ones. Open pores were believed to invite bad air. Relaxation was thought to weaken the body's defenses. Heat followed by cold could shock the system. So even when baths were taken, they were timed carefully. Never after heavy labor. Never when tired. Never when ill. And often followed by long periods of rest, warmth, and dryness. Bathing was not refreshing. It was exhausting. That's something modern descriptions often miss. Without controlled temperatures, clean towels, or warm indoor spaces, bathing could leave a person drained for hours. Muscles softened, energy dropped, and vulnerability increased. For people whose survival depended on daily labor, that vulnerability was dangerous. So bathing remained rare. In towns, bathhouses did exist, especially in earlier medieval centuries. These were social spaces as much as hygiene spaces. People talked, ate, and relaxed while soaking. But even these bathhouses were approached cautiously. They were places of leisure, not necessity. And leisure was not something everyone could afford. Over time, many bathhouses disappeared, not because people suddenly rejected cleanliness, but because the risks began to outweigh the benefits. Crowded water spread illness. Shared spaces became suspicious. Warm, enclosed rooms trapped air. People noticed patterns again. Where sickness appeared, bathhouses often followed. So they faded. What replaced them wasn't filth, but adaptation. Clothing became more important. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and could be changed more easily than washing the body. Wool outer layers regulated temperature and resisted moisture. These materials worked with the body rather than against it. People trusted their clothes to do much of the cleaning for them. This is why laundry mattered more than bathing. Clean linen against the skin was considered healthier than clean skin under dirty clothes. Changing garments refreshed the body without exposing it. It maintained dryness. It preserved warmth. Even the wealthy followed this logic. Royal households had elaborate laundry systems long before they had frequent bathing schedules. Sheets were aired. Clothes were beaten and brushed. Fur and wool were carefully maintained. Bodies stayed mostly untouched. And no one questioned it. Children grew up seeing this as normal. They learned early to wipe hands, rinse faces, dry feet, and change clothes. They learned not to linger in wet garments. Not to sit in damp places. Not to sleep with wet hair. These lessons were passed down quietly, without explanation. They didn't need explanation. They worked. So life continued this way for generations. Not clean by modern standards. Not dirty by medieval ones. Just balanced. And balance, more than purity, was the goal. The medieval world was not obsessed with removing dirt. It was obsessed with preventing weakness. Dirt could be brushed away. Weakness could kill you. So hygiene focused on strength, keeping the body resilient, warm, dry, and capable of work. Everything else was secondary. As night settled over medieval towns and villages, the routines of the day quietly reinforced these same ideas. Before sleep, people did not prepare their bodies through washing, but through adjustment. Clothes were loosened. Shoes were removed and set near the fire to dry. Hair was brushed, not cleaned, smoothing oils along the scalp and down the strands. This brushing mattered more than water ever could. Natural oils protected the skin and hair from cold, wind, and cracking. Washing them away too often left the body exposed. So instead of cleansing, people redistributed what was already there. A slow, repetitive motion, done nightly, often by firelight. This was hygiene as maintenance, not removal. Beds themselves reflected this philosophy. Straw mattresses were aired frequently. Bedding was shaken, beaten, and replaced when it became too compacted or damp. Sheets, usually linen, were changed more often than bodies were washed. Sleeping clean meant sleeping dry. And dryness, once again, was protection. People slept in nightclothes or undergarments, not naked. The fabric absorbed sweat and oils, keeping bedding cleaner longer and maintaining warmth. In colder months, hats were worn to bed to prevent heat loss. Everything was layered. The idea of exposing the entire body to cold night air would have seemed reckless. Skin was something you guarded, not displayed. Even indoors, the body remained covered. This mattered because illness was believed to enter through exposure. Sudden cold. Sudden wetness. Sudden weakness. Sleep was a vulnerable time. So hygiene at night focused on insulation, not washing. Morning routines followed the same pattern. Faces were wiped. Eyes cleaned gently. Hands rinsed before eating. Feet checked for sores or cracks. Inspection mattered. People paid close attention to changes in their bodies. A sore that didn't heal. Skin that stayed red. Swelling that lingered. These were signs of imbalance. Water was used when something was wrong, not as a daily reset. If skin became irritated, it might be washed and then treated with oils, herbs, or fats. If someone worked in particularly dirty conditions, they might wash more often, but always carefully. Nothing was automatic. This flexibility is important to understand. Medieval people were not rigidly against bathing. They simply adapted their habits to circumstance. A laborer after harvest might wash more frequently. A traveler might clean themselves upon arrival somewhere safe. A sick person might be gently washed as part of care. But these were responses, not routines. Routine bathing was unnecessary. And unnecessary things were avoided. Even religious practices reinforced this mindset. Spiritual cleanliness mattered far more than physical cleanliness. Sin was washed away through prayer, confession, and repentance, not through water on the skin. Water had symbolic power, but that didn't translate into daily physical use. Holy water cleansed the soul. Ordinary water could weaken the body. So they were kept separate. This distinction helped normalize limited bathing. You could be morally pure without being physically washed. Cleanliness was internal first. This also reduced shame around the body. Sweat, odor, and dirt were not moral failures. They were signs of labor, survival, and life. People expected them. And when everyone shares the same expectations, discomfort fades. This is why medieval descriptions rarely mention personal smell unless it is extreme. Odors blended into the environment. Smoke, animals, earth, and people all smelled like life being lived. No single scent stood out. Only decay did. Rotting wounds. Spoiled food. Standing water. These smells were warnings. These were treated seriously. But a human body doing human work. That was normal. So medieval hygiene was less about self-control and more about environmental awareness. Knowing when something crossed from safe into dangerous. Water crossed that line easily. It cooled the body. Softened the skin. Created dampness that lingered. Required fuel to reverse its effects. So it was used sparingly. And in that restraint, people built a system that, while imperfect, sustained them for centuries. Seasonal change shaped medieval hygiene more than any written rule ever did. Winter demanded caution. Summer allowed a little flexibility. Spring and autumn were times of watchfulness, when illness most often appeared. Cold months were the most dangerous. Water chilled quickly. Clothes dried slowly. Fires consumed precious fuel. During winter, full bathing nearly vanished from daily life. Even partial washing was reduced unless absolutely necessary. Instead, people focused on preservation. Skin was protected with animal fats, oils, and ointments. These sealed in warmth and prevented cracking. Hair was braided or bound to reduce exposure. Gloves, socks, and layered garments kept extremities dry. Hands and feet were watched closely. Frostbite, sores, and infections began there. So those areas were cleaned when needed, dried thoroughly, and kept covered. This was practical care, not neglect. In summer, attitudes shifted slightly. Heat allowed moisture to evaporate more easily. Clothes dried faster. Rivers became more accessible. Some people washed more often during hot months, especially after heavy labor. But even then, bathing was brief. Quick immersion. Quick rinse. Immediate drying. Lingering in water was still discouraged. Swimming for pleasure was rare and sometimes frowned upon. Cold water shocked the body. Warm water relaxed it too much. Balance mattered. Summer also brought new concerns. Standing water bred illness. Heat spoiled food. Insects spread disease. Hygiene during these months focused less on the body and more on surroundings. Waste was removed quickly. Homes were aired. Food was stored carefully. Bedding was exposed to sunlight when possible. Sunlight was one of the few forces universally trusted. It dried. It warmed. It purified. So sheets and clothes were hung outside. Straw mattresses were turned. Even rooms were left open during the day to let light in. This was cleaning without water. And it worked well enough. Children learned these rhythms early. They were taught when to wash and when not to. When water helped and when it harmed. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was observed, corrected, and absorbed. A child who stayed wet too long would be scolded. A child who removed too many layers in cold weather would be warned. These lessons were about survival, not cleanliness. Cleanliness was a side effect. As people aged, their routines changed. Elderly bodies were considered more vulnerable. They were bathed gently, less often, and with more care. Warm cloths, oils, and massages replaced immersion. Again, water was not the primary tool. Touch was. Care came through warmth, pressure, and dryness. Families understood this instinctively. A fragile body could not handle sudden changes. So they avoided them. Even death reflected these beliefs. Bodies were washed after death, not before. The risk no longer mattered. Water became safe only when life had left. This separation is telling. Bathing was appropriate for the dead, not the living. It marked transition, not maintenance. That doesn't mean medieval people disliked water. They relied on it for drinking, cooking, brewing, and farming. But they understood its power. They respected it enough not to overuse it. Modern life teaches us that more cleaning is always better. Medieval life taught the opposite. More intervention meant more risk. So they intervened only when needed. This approach created a quiet confidence. People trusted their bodies to regulate themselves. Sweat cooled. Oils protected. Dirt fell away. Clothes absorbed excess. Nothing had to be forced. And when something went wrong, it was addressed carefully, locally, and slowly. That slowness is what allowed life to continue in a world without modern medicine. Not comfort. Not luxury. Caution. And caution shaped everything, including how often a person touched water with their skin. Over time, this cautious relationship with the body created something modern people rarely experience: familiarity. Medieval people knew how their bodies felt from day to day without constant interference. They noticed subtle changes because nothing was constantly resetting those sensations. Skin texture. Muscle tension. Breathing in cold air. These were not background noise. They were signals. A person could tell when they were overtired, underfed, or becoming ill simply by how their body responded to routine. Nothing masked those responses. No frequent hot baths to relax warning tension. No scented soaps to hide changes in smell. No artificial warmth to blur the line between comfort and danger. The body spoke clearly. And people listened. This awareness influenced how work was paced. Laborers rested when sweat cooled too quickly. Farmers paused when hands stiffened. Craftsmen warmed fingers before fine work. These adjustments prevented injury and illness far more effectively than washing ever could. Sweat itself was not feared. It was understood. Sweating meant effort. Effort meant productivity. Productivity meant survival. The danger came after sweat, when wet skin met cold air. So drying mattered more than cleaning. People carried spare cloths. They changed shirts midday. They stood near fires after work. The goal was never to remove sweat entirely, only to manage its consequences. Even odors were interpreted differently. A strong smell after labor was expected. A sour or unusual smell was a warning. People learned the difference. This sensitivity is something modern hygiene has dulled. When everything smells like soap, warning signs disappear. Medieval people lived without that filter. That didn't make life pleasant. It made it survivable. Illness, when it came, was treated gently. Sick people were not scrubbed. They were kept warm. Their bedding was changed. Their skin was wiped, not washed. Oils were applied to prevent cracking. Fluids were given slowly. Bathing the sick was avoided unless absolutely necessary. Weak bodies could not handle shock. So care focused on stability. This applied even during epidemics. When disease spread, people did not turn to more water. They turned to separation. Fresh air. Warmth. Burning herbs. Limiting contact. They avoided crowded baths even more. Again, patterns ruled decisions. Water did not stop disease. Distance sometimes did. Over generations, this built a deep cultural understanding: cleanliness alone does not equal health. Balance does. A clean body that is cold, wet, and exhausted will fall ill faster than a dirty body that is warm, dry, and fed. That truth shaped every choice. Even when new ideas entered Europe, through trade, travel, or ancient texts, this practical knowledge remained dominant. Theories came and went. Daily habits stayed. Because they worked. By the late medieval period, bathing had become symbolic rather than practical. It marked events. Births. Weddings. Healing rituals. Preparation for death. It was not part of ordinary life. Ordinary life required endurance. And endurance favored routines that demanded little and gave much. So people brushed, wiped, aired, dried, changed clothes, and moved on. Day after day. Season after season. Not obsessed with purity. Not afraid of dirt. Simply focused on making it through tomorrow. This understanding of balance extended into diet as well. Medieval people knew that the body's strength and resilience were directly linked to what it consumed. Food hygiene mattered more than bathing because the wrong meal could weaken the body far faster than a lack of water. Grains were stored carefully. Bread was baked regularly. Meat was salted or smoked. Fish was dried or pickled. Fermentation was common. Drinks were often lightly fermented to reduce the risk of harmful microbes. Ale, cider, mead, these were not indulgences, but practical safety measures. Water alone could be dangerous. Stagnant water allowed illness to spread. Fermentation reduced that danger while still hydrating the body. It also provided calories and mild intoxication, enough to relax without compromising survival skills. In this context, bathing daily was not needed. A person's internal resilience was far more important than the superficial removal of sweat or dirt. They trusted the body to handle what it encountered, and they managed what they could: warmth, dryness, food, and air. Clothing was another extension of this principle. Garments were layered, designed for warmth and moisture management. Linen shirts against the skin absorbed sweat and could be changed or aired. Wool overgarments insulated and resisted moisture. Leather provided durability and protection. These layers kept the body dry and regulated temperature naturally, reducing the need for washing the skin. Even shoes reflected this logic. Raised soles, thick leather, and secure bindings prevented water from reaching the feet, which were among the most vulnerable parts of the body. Wet feet caused illness, so shoes were maintained carefully, cleaned when necessary, and aired when possible. People became remarkably skilled at interpreting their own comfort and health from these cues. Dampness in clothing, soreness in muscles, stiffness in joints, all of these signals guided action. Washing the body was just one of many tools, and often a less safe one than simply staying dry and warm. Sleep, again, was carefully managed. Bedding was shaken, aired, and occasionally beaten. Mats, straw, and blankets were arranged to prevent moisture accumulation. Nightcaps were worn in winter. Nightclothes were layered to regulate temperature. The body rested dry and insulated, minimizing the need for cleaning in the morning. Even in towns, people followed these principles. Floors were swept, straw refreshed, waste removed promptly. Airflow was prioritized. Homes were not sealed environments. Children absorbed these routines naturally. They learned to adjust clothing, move to stay warm, change garments when wet, and interpret the body's signals. Knowledge was passed through observation, correction, and example. Bathing remained rare, a special event tied to circumstance rather than habit. And through all of this, people survived. Epidemics occurred, of course, and diseases spread, but routine illness was largely managed through consistency, environmental awareness, and caution rather than frequent washing. Medieval hygiene was practical, conservative, and resilient. It emphasized prevention, not ritual. It valued dryness, warmth, ventilation, and exposure over the dramatic cleansing that modern culture often assumes is essential. It worked because it aligned with the reality of the environment and the limits of human physiology at the time. The lesson is subtle but clear. Hygiene does not exist solely in the bath or under soap. It exists in awareness, discipline, and patterns that minimize risk while maximizing survival. Medieval people understood that instinctively. And in that understanding, there is a rhythm that carried them through centuries, a rhythm of careful observation, restraint, and adaptation that modern people rarely experience in their sanitized, temperature-controlled lives. Seasonal work also reinforced hygiene practices in ways that modern observers might overlook. Spring planting, summer harvest, autumn preparation, and winter maintenance each demanded its own attention to the body. Wet fields, early morning dew, and cold winds required layered clothing, careful movement, and prompt attention to moisture. Sweat from labor was managed with regular airing and clothing changes. Damp hands were dried before touching food. Shoes were removed and dried near fires at night. Dirt that fell during work was brushed off before it could accumulate. These routines were subtle, invisible, and continuous. Even mealtimes were structured with hygiene in mind, though not in ways modern people would recognize. Hands were rinsed before eating. Surfaces were wiped or swept. Leftovers were removed promptly, eaten, or discarded. Plates were not washed after every meal in most households, but crumbs and scraps were not allowed to linger. Waste was never tolerated long enough to attract pests. The open-air aspect of rural life mirrored the logic of Viking long-ships centuries earlier. Constant airflow, sunlight, and exposure meant moisture evaporated quickly. Surfaces dried, smells dissipated, and pathogens had fewer opportunities to thrive. Life in enclosed spaces was approached cautiously, not because people feared germs as we understand them, but because stagnant conditions caused noticeable illness and discomfort. Clothing management remained a central part of hygiene. Undergarments were washed or aired more frequently than outer layers. Wool, leather, and fur were brushed and dried. Linens were changed whenever possible. Sleeping garments were rotated. Shoes were repaired and dried carefully. The body remained protected without being scrubbed. Children and apprentices learned these routines through observation and correction. Knowledge was implicit. A damp shirt was changed. Feet were inspected. Hair was brushed. The environment taught its own rules, and people learned to read them. Even illnesses were treated in ways that emphasized preservation over intervention. Fevers were managed with warmth and rest. Wounds were cleaned carefully and covered, often with oils or herbs. Baths were rarely part of treatment except in very controlled circumstances. Movement, ventilation, and careful monitoring were prioritized over water immersion. This mindset persisted despite the occasional arrival of new ideas from trade, travel, or texts. Foreign customs, baths, or hygiene theories were adapted cautiously. They were not adopted wholesale. The body was too fragile, the environment too unpredictable, and the experience of generations too valuable to ignore. In this context, medieval life emerges as a series of small, deliberate choices rather than dramatic rituals. Washing the body was one small element among many. Managing moisture, heat, clothing, and air quality mattered far more. Attention to daily patterns, to timing, to environmental cues, and to personal observation maintained health more effectively than frequent bathing ever could. And yet, this slow, subtle approach created a remarkable resilience. People lived, worked, and survived in conditions that modern imagination might consider hostile. They did not bathe often, but they did not fall ill constantly either. They relied on observation, routine, discipline, and adaptation. Hygiene was present, but in a form unfamiliar to modern expectations. It was functional. It was sustainable. And it endured because it aligned with the realities of life. Rivers, wells, and streams were integrated into this system of practical hygiene, but always with caution. Water was precious and sometimes dangerous. Stagnant pools, muddy banks, and contaminated wells could undo months of careful habits. People learned which sources were safe for drinking, which were safe for washing hands or tools, and which were to be avoided entirely. Even water used for cooking was managed carefully. Boiling, straining, and careful storage were more important than washing the body. Hygiene existed in the kitchen as much as on the skin. Utensils were cleaned, scraps discarded, and leftovers stored in ways that minimized spoilage. The body, in comparison, required much less direct attention. Clothing continued to act as a barrier between the body and environmental risk. Layers were rotated, aired, and dried. Shoes were cared for. Gloves, cloaks, and hats were not luxury, they were protection. Children were dressed according to season and task, learning through practice that staying dry and warm was more critical than staying visibly clean. Even small routines reflected an understanding of risk. Wiping hands before meals, brushing hair to distribute oils, shaking out straw mattresses, moving bedding to sunlight, all of these maintained hygiene without water immersion. Subtle, continuous management prevented illness more effectively than occasional baths ever could. Sleep reinforced these habits. Bedding was shaken, aired, and rotated. Nightclothes were layered. Firelight provided warmth and ensured dryness. Nightcaps and extra blankets protected vulnerable parts of the body. The body rested dry, insulated, and ready for the day ahead. This system extended into social life. When people gathered, they carried their own hygiene practices with them. Travelers aired their clothing, covered wounds, and managed moisture before entering homes. Hosts maintained dry, ventilated rooms, removed waste promptly, and prioritized airflow. The invisible rules of hygiene were everywhere, embedded in every action. Even work in towns, workshops, and fields followed these principles. Carpentry, baking, farming, and textile work produced sweat, dust, and dirt, but these were managed through clothing, airflow, and careful timing. Hands were rinsed or wiped, tools were cleaned, and surfaces were kept dry. Hygiene was functional, not aesthetic. Children grew up within this system. They learned to observe their bodies and their surroundings. They learned the consequences of damp clothing, stagnant bedding, and spoiled food. They learned to respond with layered clothing, careful drying, and attention to warmth. Bathing remained occasional, tied to circumstance rather than habit. Even illness was approached carefully. Fevers were managed with warmth and rest, not hot baths. Wounds were cleaned gently and protected with oils or herbs. The sick were kept dry, insulated, and monitored. Intervention prioritized stability over cleanliness. In short, medieval hygiene was a continuous, adaptive practice. It emphasized observation, prevention, and balance. It relied on clothing, heat, airflow, sunlight, and careful management of food and water. It was practical, sustainable, and remarkably effective. Through all of this, people survived. They endured cold, heat, labor, and travel. They remained resilient without the frequent bathing we assume is essential. Their hygiene worked quietly, behind the scenes, in ways modern eyes rarely appreciate. The lesson is subtle: survival does not always require constant intervention. Careful observation, consistent routines, and attention to environmental cues often achieve more than dramatic rituals ever could. Medieval people also understood that hygiene was as much about timing as it was about action. Certain tasks were safer at certain times of day or during specific seasons. Water, for example, was often used in the morning to rinse hands before meals, but full immersion was rare and reserved for special circumstances. Even the body's natural rhythms were observed. Sweat, warmth, and energy levels dictated when work was done, when meals were eaten, and when rest was taken. Hygiene was not a separate activity, it was integrated into the daily flow of life. Air and sunlight remained essential. Homes and workspaces were ventilated whenever possible. Windows were opened, fires maintained, and bedding exposed to daylight. Surfaces were brushed, floors swept, and straw turned. These measures allowed moisture and odors to dissipate naturally. Bathing, in this context, was risky. Immersion could cool the body too quickly, soften the skin, and create conditions for illness. Water was used strategically, on hands, face, or feet, when necessary, but not for full-body cleansing unless circumstances allowed warmth and rapid drying afterward.